Welcome to the Trend Reddit channel. This is a place where we share interesting, humorous, and emotional stories about family life. Each episode will be a journey exploring familiar situations that we all may encounter in our own families. 24 years ago, a ruthless decision changed the fate of two people. A wealthy man, in a fit of rage, fired a black woman after she became pregnant with his child. Now, when another man steps into his office, the secrets and sins of the past suddenly resurface. What will happen when the past confronts the present? Let's laugh, reflect, and sometimes shed tears with these meaningful stories. If you love heartwarming and relatable tales, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our videos. Be sure to click the notification bell to get the latest updates on our new episodes. Thank you for your support and for being with Trend Reddit. The rain tapped softly against the towering glass windows of Hamilton Insurance, a prestigious firm renowned for its impeccable reputation and influential clients. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with the quiet hum of computers, the soft murmur of phone calls, and the clicking of polished shoes on sleek marble floors. The building's grandiose architecture reflected its status, a testament to the empire built by Victor Hamilton, the charismatic yet aloof CEO. Among the many faces that blended into the firm's rigid corporate structure was Lila Bennett, an employee known for her dedication and quiet resilience. Lila had worked at Hamilton Insurance for years, climbing the corporate ladder slowly but surely. She wasn't in the boardroom, making multimillion-dollar decisions, but her role was indispensable. As one of the senior managers in the claims department, Lila ensured that clients received fair treatment. She was a beacon of calm amid the storm of corporate greed that often swirled around her. Her dedication to her job had earned her respect from her peers, but respect was a currency that couldn't buy protection from the unexpected. On that particular morning, Lila stood in front of the mirror in the ladies' restroom, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down the front of her black pencil skirt. She had news that would change everything. Her reflection revealed tired eyes, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. She knew that what she was about to share with Victor Hamilton would set her life on an unpredictable course. After weeks of anxious waiting, the test results had confirmed what she'd suspected. She was pregnant. It should have been a moment of joy, a celebration of new life. But for Lila, the timing was anything but perfect. The corporate world wasn't kind to women in her position, and Hamilton Insurance, despite its outward professionalism, had a cutthroat environment. The idea of telling Victor, the man who ruled the company with an iron fist, filled her with dread. His reputation preceded him. He was a man who valued success above all, especially his own. Taking a deep breath, Lila walked out of the restroom and made her way toward the elevator that would take her to the top floor, the floor where decisions were made, where power was wielded. The cold metal doors slid open, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. When the elevator dinged to signal her arrival, she squared her shoulders and stepped out, walking the length of the glossy corridor leading to Victor's corner office. The office was as intimidating as its owner. A massive desk of dark mahogany dominated the room, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city skyline. Everything about it screamed success, from the expensive art on the walls to the leather chairs that only high-ranking clients were allowed to sit in. Behind the desk sat Victor Hamilton, impeccably dressed as always, his sharp eyes barely looking up from his paperwork as Lila entered the room. His focus was intense, his demeanor cold. Victor wasn't the type to engage in small talk or pleasantries, he preferred efficiency and results. His salt-and-pepper hair gave him an air of distinguished authority, and though he had aged, his presence was still as commanding as ever. Lila, he acknowledged her without lifting his gaze. "What is it?" "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Mr. Hamilton, I need to speak with you about something important." He finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with a mixture of impatience and curiosity. "Important," he repeated, his tone betraying no hint of concern. "What could be more important than the board meeting we have in a few minutes?" Lila's heart raced. "I'm pregnant, Mr. Hamilton." For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Victor's expression didn't change, but Lila could see the faintest flicker of something behind his eyes, annoyance, perhaps. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folding over his chest as he stared at her, considering her words. "And," he said flatly. Lila blinked. "I thought you should know. I'm going to need some time off, eventually. I'll work up until I can, but afterward, I'll have to." Victor raised a hand, cutting her off. "Lila, we don't have time for this." His voice was calm, too calm. "You've been a good employee, but I don't run a charity here. We need people who are fully committed to their roles." The weight of his words settled over her like a lead blanket. "But Mr. Hamilton, I've worked here for years. I've given everything to this company." Victor's eyes hardened. "And I appreciate that, but you know how this industry works. Hamilton Insurance has a reputation to uphold. I can't afford to have distractions, personal or otherwise, impacting our performance." The realization hit Lila like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just indifferent to her situation, he was about to fire her. "You're letting me go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor sighed, a small gesture of exasperation. "It's nothing personal, Lila. Business decisions are rarely personal. But you should have known what you were getting into when you decided to." He waved his hand dismissively. "You understand." Lila's chest tightened. She had seen this coming, yet it still hurt more than she had anticipated. This was more than just a job, it was her stability, her livelihood, and now, with a child on the way, it was everything. She couldn't afford to lose it. "I'll make sure you get a severance package," Victor continued, already moving on in his mind. "Consider it compensation for your years of service." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain calm. There was no point in arguing. Victor Hamilton wasn't the kind of man who changed his mind, especially when his mind was made up. She nodded, her throat tight, and turned to leave, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back as she walked out of the office. The elevator ride down was a blur, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of anger, fear, and disbelief. How could he do this? How could he discard her so easily, after everything? As the elevator doors slid open, Lila stepped out into the bustling office space, the familiar hum of everyday activity suddenly feeling distant and foreign. She was no longer part of this world. Later that day, Lila sat in her car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The rain had stopped, but the overcast sky remained, casting a dull gray light over everything. She had left the office hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to drive home. The events of the morning kept replaying in her mind, the cold dismissal, Victor's indifferent words, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had settled deep in her chest. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the future she had envisioned for herself and her child. A future that now seemed uncertain, hanging by a thread. She had been naive to think that Victor would care, that he would see her as more than just another employee. To him, she was expendable, a minor inconvenience to be dealt with swiftly and without emotion. But as Lila sat there, a new feeling began to creep in, a quiet resolve. Victor might have the power to fire her, but he couldn't take away her determination. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. She had a baby on the way, and that baby needed her to be strong, to fight for what was right. With a deep breath, Lila started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward the one place she knew she could clear her head, the local park. It was a small, unassuming space, with a few benches and a playground. It wasn't much, but it had always been a sanctuary for her, a place where she could think without the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the cool air hit her face, refreshing her in a way that the sterile office environment never could. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the playground, a reminder of the life growing inside her. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. No matter what happened, she was going to protect this child. That was the one thing she knew for sure. Lila walked along the gravel path, her footsteps crunching beneath her as she made her way to a familiar bench. She had sat there countless times, watching the world go by, but today, everything felt different. The weight of what had happened at the office pressed down on her, heavier than ever before. As she sat down, her phone buzzed in her bag. She hesitated for a moment before pulling it out, already knowing who it was. Ethan. Her son. He had just started his first day at Hamilton Insurance, the same company where she had dedicated so many years of her life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She stared at the screen, debating whether or not to answer. She didn't want to burden Ethan with her problems, especially not on his first day. But he would find out eventually. She couldn't keep this from him forever. With a sigh, she pressed the answer button and brought the phone to her ear. "Hey, Mom," Ethan's voice came through, cheerful and full of energy. "I just wanted to let you know how things are going." Lila smiled despite herself. Ethan had always been the optimistic one, the light in her life when things got tough. "How's the first day?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's great. Everyone's been really welcoming, and the office is amazing. I mean, it's a little overwhelming, but I'm getting the hang of it." He paused for a moment. "How about you? How's everything at work?" Her heart sank. She hadn't expected him to ask so soon. Lila swallowed, trying to find the right words. "It's complicated," she said carefully. "I'm actually not at the office right now." Ethan's voice grew concerned. "Is everything okay?" Lila hesitated. She didn't want to ruin his excitement, but she also couldn't lie to him. I was let go today." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Lila could picture Ethan's expression, his brow furrowed, his eyes wide with shock. "What? Why? You've been there for years." "It's complicated," she repeated, her voice soft. "Victor made his decision, and there's nothing I can do about it." Ethan was quiet for a moment before speaking again, his voice low and filled with anger. "That's not fair. You've given everything to that company." Lila closed her eyes, the familiar sting of tears welling up. She hadn't cried in Victor's office, but now, alone in the park, the emotions she had been holding back threatened to overwhelm her. "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes, life isn't fair." "I want to talk to him," Ethan said suddenly, his voice firm. "I want to go to his office and tell him exactly what I think of him." "No," Lila said quickly, her heart racing at the thought. "Ethan, don't. It won't change anything. You have a good job there. Don't jeopardize it because of me." "But, Mom." "Promise me," she interrupted, her voice pleading. "Promise me you won't do anything. I don't want you to get caught up in this. You have your whole career ahead of you." Ethan was silent again, and Lila could hear the frustration in his breathing. Finally, he spoke, his voice resigned. "Okay. I promise." "Thank you," she said softly, relief washing over her. "I just need some time to figure things out. But I'll be okay." They spoke for a few more minutes, with Lila doing her best to reassure Ethan that everything would be fine. But as she hung up the phone and slipped it back into her bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was fine. Victor had stripped her of her job, her security, and in a way, her dignity. And now, she had to figure out how to move forward, not just for herself, but for the child she carried. Lila sat there for a long time, watching the clouds drift slowly across the sky. The park was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside her. But she knew that peace wouldn't last. There were decisions to be made, challenges to face, and Victor Hamilton wasn't going to make any of it easy. She stood up, her legs feeling heavier than before, and started walking back to her car. As she reached the door, she paused, glancing back at the playground one last time. The children were still laughing, running around without a care in the world. For a moment, she envied them. Their lives were simple, unburdened by the complexities of adulthood. But life wasn't simple anymore. Not for her. And as Lila drove away from the park, she couldn't help but wonder what her next move would be. Days had passed since Lila's unexpected dismissal, and the sting of Victor's cold words lingered in the back of her mind like a haunting echo. Life, however, continued its unrelenting pace. Her son, Ethan, had settled into his new role at Hamilton Insurance with growing enthusiasm. It was ironic, in a way, that the very company which had discarded her was now providing him with a promising future. Lila hadn't told him much more about the circumstances surrounding her dismissal, just enough to spare him the full weight of her burden. On the morning of Ethan's first official day of work, Lila stood in the kitchen, watching him from across the table as he fiddled with his tie. His excitement was palpable, his youthful energy radiating through the room as he adjusted his appearance for what would be his first day as an official employee. His eyes gleamed with the kind of optimism that Lila had once carried herself when she first started at Hamilton Insurance all those years ago. But life, as she had learned, often had its own plans. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. Mom, are you sure I look alright? Ethan asked, his brow furrowing as he gave his reflection a critical look in the kitchen mirror. You look perfect, Lila said with a smile, though her heart ached slightly at the sight of him. It wasn't just that he was growing up so quickly, but the fact that he was now entering the very world that had hurt her. You're going to do great today. I'm a little nervous, Ethan admitted, tying his shoelaces with focused concentration. But I guess that's normal, right? Completely normal, Lila reassured him, stepping closer to smooth a wrinkle in his shirt. It's good to be a little nervous. It means you care about doing a good job. He looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and excitement. Thanks, Mom. I'll make you proud. You already do, Lila said, kissing him on the forehead. Just be yourself, and everything will fall into place. Ethan grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Lila watched him go, pride and worry swirling within her. As much as she wanted to believe that everything would be all right for Ethan, the company he was stepping into was the same one that had discarded her without a second thought. She couldn't help but wonder if he would eventually see Hamilton Insurance for what it truly was. Later that day, as Lila sat at the dining room table, her thoughts inevitably drifted back to the conversation she had with Ethan the night before. He had mentioned something offhand about Hamilton's corporate culture, how it was competitive, fast-paced, and unforgiving. She had smiled, offering him motherly encouragement, but inwardly she had known all too well what he was stepping into. She remembered her own time there, how the pressures had mounted year after year, the way the company's veneer of professionalism masked a relentless hunger for success at any cost. The door creaked open, and Ethan walked in, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and sank into the chair opposite Lila, who looked up from her tea, her expression curious. "How was your first day?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the concern that lingered beneath. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It was intense. But in a good way, I think. There's just so much to learn, and everyone moves so fast. It's like they're all on autopilot, but somehow it works." Lila nodded, sipping her tea. "That's how it is at places like Hamilton. You have to keep up, or you get left behind." He laughed softly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "I just hope I don't get left behind." "You won't," Lila said firmly. "You're smart, hardworking, and capable. You'll do just fine." Ethan smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders slightly. "Thanks, Mom. I just need to find my rhythm, I guess." As they sat in companionable silence, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling him everything. But she also knew that it wasn't the time to burden him with her own grievances. Ethan needed to make his own way, to learn for himself what kind of company he was working for. And though it pained her to think of him possibly facing the same hardships she had, Lila knew that she couldn't shield him from reality forever. That night, as Ethan sat in his room reviewing some documents for work, Lila stood outside his door, hesitating for a moment before knocking softly. When he called for her to come in, she entered, holding a cup of tea for him. Ethan looked up from his desk, smiling at her presence. Thought you might need a break, Lila said, placing the tea beside him. Thanks, Ethan replied, rubbing his eyes. It's a lot to take in. I'm trying to familiarize myself with everything before tomorrow. Lila nodded, taking a seat on the edge of his bed. It's good to be prepared. But don't push yourself too hard. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. Yeah, I know. It's just that I really want to make a good impression. Hamilton Insurance is a big deal. Lila winced inwardly at the mention of the company's name, but she kept her expression neutral. You're going to make a great impression, Ethan. Just trust in yourself. He looked at her with genuine appreciation, then glanced down at the papers in front of him. You know, I've been meaning to ask you more about your time at Hamilton. You never really talk about it. Lila stiffened slightly but forced herself to remain composed. It was a long time ago, she said softly. Things were different back then. But you must have learned a lot while you were there, Ethan pressed. I mean, you worked there for years. What was it like? Lila hesitated, searching for the right words. She didn't want to dampen his enthusiasm, but she also didn't want to sugarcoat the truth. It was challenging, she admitted, choosing her words carefully. There were good moments, of course, but there were also a lot of difficult ones. Corporate life isn't always easy, and sometimes you have to make tough choices. Ethan frowned, sensing the weight behind her words. Is that why you left? Lila swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected him to ask that so directly. It's complicated, she said quietly. But it was time for me to move on. Ethan studied her face for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. I get the feeling there's more to the story. Lila smiled sadly, standing up and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Maybe one day I'll tell you everything. But for now, just focus on your job and making the most of the opportunity you have. Ethan nodded, though his curiosity was clearly piqued. All right. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Thank you, Ethan, Lila said softly. That means a lot. As she left his room, Lila felt a heaviness in her chest. She had never been one to burden Ethan with her struggles, but she knew that eventually, he would have to face the truth about Hamilton Insurance, and about Victor Hamilton. The question was, would he be ready when that time came? The soft hum of chatter and the clinking of silverware echoed through the upscale restaurant, creating a sophisticated atmosphere for those dining within its walls. Victor Hamilton sat at a round table near the center, surrounded by his family. His wife, Catherine, was seated beside him, elegantly poised as always, her eyes scanning the menu with practiced disinterest. Across from them sat their son, Oliver, a younger version of Victor in both looks and demeanor, occasionally glancing at his phone under the table. It was a typical family dinner, reserved and formal, as was expected in the Hamilton household. The restaurant was one of the city's finest, a place frequented by the elite, where privacy was a luxury afforded by dim lighting and discreet waitstaff. Victor had chosen the restaurant not only for its impeccable reputation but because it offered a sanctuary from the prying eyes of the public. Here, he could maintain his polished image without interruption. But that evening, the sanctuary was about to be shattered. Ethan Bennett entered the restaurant, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the entire day at work trying to focus on his tasks, but the weight of what his mother had told him had been impossible to ignore. As he walked past the polished tables and impeccably dressed patrons, his eyes scanned the room until they landed on Victor Hamilton. The man who had callously discarded his mother. The man who thought he could simply erase her from his life as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. Ethan's jaw tightened as he made his way toward the table. His hands balled into fists at his sides, though he forced himself to remain composed. He couldn't afford to lose control now. Not here, in front of Victor's family. He wanted to confront Victor, but he would do it on his terms, not in a fit of rage. Victor, engrossed in a quiet conversation with Catherine about the wine selection, didn't notice Ethan approaching at first. It wasn't until Ethan reached the table and stood directly in front of them that Victor looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. "Can I help you?" Victor asked, his tone sharp, not yet recognizing the young man standing before him. Ethan's eyes flicked to Catherine and Oliver, who both stared at him in mild surprise. Catherine, ever the picture of elegance, raised an eyebrow, clearly waiting for some kind of explanation for the interruption. Oliver looked vaguely amused, as though the appearance of an unknown figure in their midst was a welcome diversion from the otherwise mundane evening. "You don't remember me, do you?" Ethan's voice was calm, though every word carried a weight that made Victor pause. Victor studied him for a moment longer, then a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You're the new employee at the firm, aren't you?" "Ethan Bennett." "That's right," Ethan said, his gaze hardening. "Ethan Bennett. Lila Bennett's son." The mention of Lila's name seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained composed. "What is this about, Ethan? I don't have time for whatever personal grievances you might have. I'm here with my family." Ethan ignored the dismissive tone, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm not here for your time, Mr. Hamilton. I'm here for the truth." Victor's expression darkened, though he maintained his cold composure. "I suggest you leave before you say something you'll regret." Catherine's gaze shifted between the two men, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Victor, what's going on?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with concern. Ethan didn't wait for Victor to answer. Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady but filled with a deep sense of betrayal. "My mother worked for you for years. She dedicated her life to your company. She gave everything she had, and when she needed your support the most, you fired her." Victor's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Ethan. Ethan continued, his voice rising slightly as the weight of his words began to hit home. "She came to you, pregnant with me, and you threw her out like she was nothing. You didn't care about her or about what she was going through. You only cared about your reputation. You only cared about yourself." Catherine's eyes widened, and Oliver shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension at the table was palpable, the elegant dinner setting now feeling oppressive under the weight of the confrontation. Victor's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and measured, though there was an edge of anger beneath it. "I made a business decision, Ethan. Your mother was a good employee, but personal matters have no place in business." Ethan's hands clenched into fists again, but he forced himself to stay calm. "A business decision? Is that what you call abandoning someone when they need help? Is that what you call discarding people's lives for your own convenience?" Catherine's voice broke the silence, her tone soft but firm. "Victor, is this true? Did you really fire this boy's mother when she was pregnant?" Victor's eyes flicked to his wife, and for a brief moment, his mask of composure faltered. "It was a long time ago, Catherine. It's not as simple as it sounds." "It's exactly as simple as it sounds," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You ruined her life. She had to raise me on her own, with no support from you, no job, no security. And you? You went on living your life as if nothing happened." Oliver, who had been silent up until now, shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. "Dad, is this true?" Victor's gaze hardened again as he looked at his son. "I did what I had to do for the company. Lila knew the risks of working in this industry." Ethan's eyes flashed with anger. "Risks? She wasn't just another employee, Victor. She was a human being. A person. And you treated her like she was expendable." Victor leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I won't apologize for the decisions I made, Ethan. You're too young to understand how the world works. This is business. Emotions have no place in it." Ethan took a step closer, his voice now barely above a whisper, but filled with a quiet fury. "You think this is just about business? You think you can just hide behind that excuse forever? You're not just a businessman, Victor. You're a coward." The word hung in the air, and for the first time that evening, Victor's composure broke. His expression twisted into a scowl, but before he could respond, Ethan turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the Hamilton family to sit in stunned silence at the table. Catherine's eyes were wide, her expression one of shock and disbelief. Oliver stared at his father, his face pale and tense. And Victor? Victor sat there, unmoving, his carefully constructed world suddenly feeling more fragile than ever before. The fallout from Ethan's confrontation with Victor rippled through the days that followed, casting a long shadow over everything. The tense dinner had shattered the Hamilton family's carefully maintained facade, and whispers began circulating around the office. Victor, who had always appeared untouchable, now seemed shaken, though he would never admit it to anyone. His impenetrable armor of power and success had developed a crack, and the people around him had begun to notice. Victor sat alone in his office, the blinds drawn to shut out the world. The room, usually a symbol of his authority, felt smaller now, the once imposing desk and walls closing in on him. He couldn't escape the memory of Ethan's words, the accusation that had cut deeper than anything he had heard in years. Coward. It echoed in his mind like a refrain he couldn't shake. His phone buzzed on the desk, but he ignored it, his thoughts too consumed by the events that had unfolded. Catherine had barely spoken to him since that night, her silence a constant reminder of the confrontation. Oliver had looked at him with an expression that Victor hadn't recognized, something between disappointment and confusion. For the first time in a long time, Victor didn't know how to fix things. He had built his entire life on control over his business, control over his family, control over himself. But now, that control was slipping, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts, and before he could respond, the door opened to reveal Catherine standing in the doorway. She looked different, more distant, as if something had shifted between them that could not easily be repaired. "Victor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Victor gestured to the chair opposite him, but Catherine remained standing. He studied her face, searching for some clue as to what she was thinking, but her expression gave nothing away. She had always been composed, a perfect reflection of the life they had built together, but now there was something in her eyes that unsettled him. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the restaurant," Catherine continued, her gaze unwavering. "About what Ethan said, and about the choices you've made." Victor felt a prickle of irritation, though he tried to suppress it. "Catherine, you don't understand the pressures I've faced. The decisions I've had to make for this company." "I understand more than you think," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "But this isn't just about the company anymore, Victor. It's about our family. It's about the kind of man you are." Victor bristled at her words, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What do you expect me to do? Apologize for doing what was necessary?" "I expect you to be honest with yourself," Catherine said, her voice softening slightly. "For once, I want you to admit that you made a mistake. That you hurt people. That you've hurt us." Victor stared at her, his mind racing. He had spent years convincing himself that every decision he made was justified, that everything he did was for the greater good, for the company, for their family. But now, standing before his wife, he realized that he couldn't hide behind those excuses anymore. "Catherine," he began, his voice low, "I did what I thought was right at the time. I didn't want to, but I had to make tough decisions. It wasn't personal." "But it was personal," Catherine replied, stepping closer to his desk. "It was personal to Lila, and it's personal to Ethan. And it's personal to me, Victor. I can't keep pretending that it doesn't matter." Victor clenched his jaw, the words weighing on him. He had spent so long pushing aside any hint of emotion, any sign of weakness, but now, faced with the truth, he couldn't ignore it anymore. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I did." Catherine nodded slowly, her gaze softening as she saw the cracks in Victor's resolve. "You did. And now, you have a chance to make it right." Victor looked up at her, a question forming in his mind. "How?" "You need to step down," Catherine said firmly. "You need to leave the company. You've spent your entire life building Hamilton Insurance, but it's time for you to walk away." For us. For our family. The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut. Step down? Leave the company? The very idea seemed impossible. Hamilton Insurance was his life, his legacy. But as he stared into Catherine's eyes, he saw the truth. The company had become a prison, one he had built himself, and the only way to break free was to let it go. I don't know if I can, he admitted, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. You can, Catherine said gently. And you will. For your own sake. Victor leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. For years, he had defined himself by his role as CEO, by the success of the company. But now, that role had consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. If he continued down this path, he knew he would lose everything that truly mattered. All right, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. Catherine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, relief flooding her features. Thank you, Victor. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at him. Ethan deserves to know the truth, she said softly. You owe him that much. Victor nodded slowly, knowing she was right. He had wronged Ethan's mother, and now, after all these years, he had to face the consequences. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew it was the only way forward. The next day, the news broke that Victor Hamilton had resigned as CEO of Hamilton Insurance. It sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Victor had been a titan of the industry for decades, and his sudden departure left many questioning what had led to his decision. But Victor didn't care about the speculation or the rumors. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As for Ethan, he sat across from his mother at their kitchen table, a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. He had won, in a way. Victor Hamilton had been forced to confront his past, to face the truth of what he had done. But as Ethan looked at Lila, who smiled at him with quiet pride, he realized that victory wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that they were free now, free from the shadow of Hamilton Insurance, free from the pain of the past. Together, they could move forward, knowing that they had survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. And for Lila, that was enough. Several weeks had passed since Victor Hamilton's resignation, and the atmosphere around both the office and the Bennett household had drastically changed. The media buzz around Victor's departure had gradually faded, replaced by new headlines and stories. But for those directly involved, the consequences of his decision lingered, shaping their lives in ways that couldn't be undone. Ethan Bennett walked through the front door of his home after a long day at work, the familiar scent of home-cooked food filling the air. His mother, Lila, was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew with a serene expression on her face. The weight she had carried for so many years seemed to have lifted slightly, as though she could finally breathe without the burden of her past pressing down on her. Hey, Mom, Ethan greeted, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. Smells great in here. Lila turned to smile at him, her face brightening at the sight of her son. Just thought I'd make something special tonight. It's been a while since we had a proper dinner together. Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. Despite everything that had happened, these quiet moments with his mother grounded him in a way nothing else could. He walked over to the table and sat down, watching as Lila moved gracefully through the kitchen, her movements fluid and peaceful. How's work? She asked, setting 2 bowls of stew on the table before taking a seat across from him. It was good, Ethan replied, though his tone was thoughtful. Things are still settling down at the office since Victor left, but the transition seems to be going smoothly. They're bringing in a new CEO next month. Lila's brow furrowed slightly as she took a sip of her stew. And how do you feel about all of that? Ethan shrugged, unsure how to put his feelings into words. It's strange. I mean, Victor was the face of that company for so long, and now it feels like everything's shifting. But honestly, I think it's for the best. The culture there, it needs to change. Lila nodded, her expression contemplative. Sometimes it takes something drastic to push people in the right direction. Ethan looked at her, his thoughts drifting back to the confrontation he'd had with Victor at the restaurant. He had been so angry then, so filled with the need for justice, for answers. But now, with the dust settled, he realized that what he had gained wasn't just retribution, it was closure. Victor Hamilton was no longer a looming figure in their lives, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he could move forward without the past weighing him down. "I think you're right," Ethan said softly, meeting his mother's gaze. "It's like, we can finally move on." Lila smiled, a warm, maternal smile that radiated the kind of quiet strength Ethan had always admired. "We can. And we will." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the simple act of sharing a meal together filling the room with a sense of peace. For so long, Lila had carried the pain of her past in silence, protecting Ethan from the full truth of what had happened between her and Victor. But now, with the truth out in the open, there was a sense of freedom that neither of them had expected. As they finished dinner, Ethan set his bowl aside and leaned back in his chair, watching his mother clear the dishes. He knew that everything they had been through had brought them closer, and though the path hadn't been easy, it had led them to a place of understanding. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Ethan said suddenly, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. Lila paused, looking at him in surprise. "For what?" "For everything," Ethan replied. "For the way you've handled all of this, for raising me on your own, for being the strongest person I know." Lila's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his arm. "I'm proud of you too, Ethan. You've grown into an incredible man. And no matter what happens, we're going to be okay." Ethan nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. There was so much he wanted to say, so much gratitude he felt toward his mother for all the sacrifices she had made. But words didn't seem enough. Instead, he simply smiled, knowing that she understood without him needing to say anything more. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the house had quieted down, Lila sat by the window, gazing out at the night sky. The moon hung low, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The wounds from the past hadn't disappeared, but they had begun to heal, and that was enough. Ethan joined her at the window, his presence comforting as they both sat in silence, watching the world outside. The years of struggle, of uncertainty, now seemed like distant memories, replaced by the promise of a new chapter. They had both faced their demons, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, they knew they would face it together. "You know," Lila said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the stars, "for a long time, I thought I would never be able to forgive Victor. Not for what he did to me, but for what he did to you." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the admission. "And now?" Lila sighed softly, her shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. "Now, I think I've realized that holding on to that anger only hurt me. And you. But we're free of it now. We have each other, and that's what matters." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him as well. "You're right, Mom. We're going to be okay." The night stretched on, quiet and serene, and for the first time in a long time, Lila and Ethan felt a sense of closure. The past no longer had a hold on them, and as they sat together, side by side, they looked toward the future with hope. Whatever came next, they would face it with the strength they had built together. And in that moment, everything felt right. Not perfect, but enough. It was enough. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.